Welcome to Z Sci-Fi Stories, and thank you from the bottom of our hearts for tuning in today. Recently, YouTube disabled our channel's monetization, leaving us without the budget needed to keep operating and paying our dedicated team. If you find today's story thrilling, please consider supporting us with just $1 so our staff can pay for their livelihoods and continue bringing these universes to life for you. You can do this by scanning the QR code on your screen or clicking the donation link in the description or comments below. Space did not tear with a sound. It simply shattered like fragile glass in the deep freeze of the Kuiper Belt, vomiting forth a nightmare. They did not come with radio signals or diplomatic hails. Instead, 8 billion human beings simultaneously dropped to their knees as a singular, crushing voice echoed inside their own skulls. The message was cold, metallic, and absolute. The invincible fleet of the Kalan race had arrived. They were semi-mechanical entities, ancient predators wielding technology that blatantly ignored the barriers of time and physics. Through that agonizing telepathic intrusion, their ultimatum was delivered not as a negotiation, but as an undeniable fact of reality. Humanity had exactly 24 hours to surrender their entire planet, handing it over to be completely dismantled and repurposed as a biological and mineral extraction node. Any resistance would be met with absolute eradication. The psychological trauma of that voice broke human civilization instantly. Within 1 hour, the global financial system collapsed, rendering all wealth into meaningless digits on dead screens. Unprecedented panic erupted, choking every major city on Earth with riots, fire, and a profound, suffocating despair. The cosmos had finally revealed itself, and it was entirely hostile. Desperate to buy even a fraction of time, the United Military Forces of Earth deployed their entire conventional defense armadas, sending brave pilots into the dark. It was not a battle. It was a slaughter. In a sickening display of overwhelming power that lasted exactly 3 minutes, the Kalan annihilated 90% of humanity's orbital defenses. The alien vessels did not even bother to fire conventional energy weapons. They simply distorted local gravity, crumpling human cruisers and fighter squadrons into dense spheres of burning slag and crushed bone. The remnants of Earth's greatest military achievement drifted as silent tombs in the cold vacuum. While the world outside screamed in terror, Ford Burrell walked in absolute silence. He was a brilliant astrophysicist who had spent the last 10 years being mocked, defunded, and ostracized by the scientific elite. They had dismissed him as a madman for his theories on dimensional manipulation and spatial folding, calling his life's work absurd fiction. Now, as the sky turned dark with the shadows of alien dreadnoughts, his madness was the only mathematics that made any sense. Ford descended into a top-secret subterranean bunker, buried deep beneath the blistering sands of the Nevada desert. The air inside the underground command center was thick with the stench of nervous sweat and the terrifying quiet of defeated generals. Politicians wept openly, their hands trembling over communication consoles. The Earth Council was frantically preparing to broadcast a cowardly plea for mercy, hoping to offer themselves as slaves rather than face extinction. Ford watched them for a brief moment, his expression utterly devoid of emotion. Then, he bypassed their overriding security protocols with a flurry of keystrokes, permanently locking the weeping leaders out of the central transmission array. There would be no begging. There would be no surrender. Instead, under Ford's direct and unauthorized command, Earth sent a single, highly concentrated acoustic wave directed specifically at the massive Kalan flagship hovering at the edge of the system. It was not a speech pleading for the survival of humanity. It was a classical symphony, violently interwoven with a hyper-compressed, lethal sonic frequency that translated into a universal mathematical constant of pure, unadulterated malice. When decoded by the alien sensors, its meaning was unmistakable. Welcome to hell, far out in the freezing void, on the bridge of the colossal Kalan dreadnought. The Supreme Commander received the transmission. The entity did not flinch. It was a towering, nightmarish construct of pale, synthesized flesh and shifting dark metal. It absorbed the defiant human message with utter indifference. To a being that had spent countless millennia exterminating thousands of civilizations across the galaxy, this aggressive signal was nothing more than the final, pathetic death rattle of a primitive, insignificant species waiting for the slaughter. The Supreme Commander did not bother to respond. With a casual, almost bored wave of a massive mechanical hand, the leader issued a silent, telepathic order across the alien armada. 10,000 warships ignited their antimatter drives simultaneously, moving out of the Kuiper Belt like a relentless, unstoppable swarm of locusts, descending into the solar system to devour the Earth. They believed they were flying toward an easy harvest. They had no idea they were flying straight into the mind of Ford Burrell. The colossal armada of the Kalan swept past the massive gas giant Jupiter with chilling ease. They did not bother to maneuver around the largest planet in the system. Their antimatter engines simply and violently displaced its immense gravitational pull, tearing swirling storms of toxic ammonia and crushing water vapor straight into the frozen void as they passed. Confident in their absolute technological superiority, the alien vanguard arrogantly expanded their attack formation. They spread out across the black canvas of space like a monstrous, mechanical swarm of locusts, their sleek obsidian hulls blotting out the distant stars one by one. They were no longer flying in a focused, tactical spearhead. They were deliberately casting a wide, suffocating net, preparing to completely envelop the fragile blue sphere that hung defenseless in the dark. Down below, klaxons screamed across every military installation left standing on Earth. The unified human command, bleeding, terrified, and battered, made the only strategic choice left to them. They launched the absolute entirety of their remaining space forces. It was a desperate, ragtag fleet assembled from patched-up patrol frigates, heavily retrofitted orbital cargo haulers, and thousands upon thousands of fiercely determined fighter pilots. These men and women strapped themselves into cramped cockpits that smelled heavily of burning ozone and cold sweat, knowing perfectly well that this was a one-way trip into the abyss. "Engage the enemy at point-blank range," the squadron leaders roared over the heavily scrambled communication channels, their voices cracking with raw adrenaline. "Make them pay in blood for every single inch of vacuum." The human defenders hurled themselves directly into the gaping, mechanical maw of the Kalan armada. What followed was not a battle, but a terrifying spectacle of light, fury, and unyielding human grit. Heavy, kinetic artillery shells shattered uselessly against shimmering alien energy shielding, lighting up the eternal darkness with brilliant, blinding flashes of kinetic discharge. Agile human fighters darted frantically between the massive, lumbering alien dreadnoughts, unleashing continuous barrages of heat-seeking missiles until their weapon magazines clicked entirely empty. Yet, when the ammunition ran dry, the pilots did not turn back or attempt to retreat. In a breathtaking display of ultimate defiance, they rammed their burning, crippled ships directly into the unyielding hulls of the enemy vessels. They transformed their own inevitable deaths into final, blazing weapons of mass destruction. The space around Earth quickly became a chaotic graveyard of twisted, molten metal and frozen blood. However, this agonizing, monumental sacrifice was absolutely not a blind, panicked move. Far below the orbital carnage, buried deep inside the Nevada command bunker, Ford Burrell watched the glowing tactical holograms with eyes as cold as liquid nitrogen. He was not carelessly throwing those exceptionally brave men and women away out of mere desperation. He was coldly and methodically using their very lives and the planet Earth itself as the ultimate, irresistible bait. Every single human ship that charged forward to die, Every small explosion that briefly stalled the relentless enemy advance was meticulously calculated to draw the Kalin's supreme command deeper and deeper into a highly specific, fatal orbital pocket. Ford desperately needed the alien fleet packed tightly together. He needed them arrogant, entirely focused on the slaughter, and completely blind to the true nature of the battlefield they were entering. "Hold the line," Ford whispered softly to the silent, flickering screens, watching the tragic human casualty numbers skyrocket into the tens of thousands. "Just bleed them a little longer." Growing impatient with the persistent human gnats stinging at their impenetrable armor, the Kalin decided to deploy their most horrific siege weapons. Colossal, jagged bays opened slowly along the dark underbellies of their primary dreadnoughts, violently releasing thousands of energy-sucking beasts. These were horrifying, biomechanical monstrosities, representing a sickening, unnatural fusion of undulating, purple organic flesh and razor-sharp metallic plating. The colossal beasts plummeted toward Earth like living meteors, unfurling massive, electrified tendrils as they slammed violently into the upper ionosphere. They latched onto the planet's fragile, invisible electromagnetic shield like gigantic cosmic parasites, their glowing, toothless maws literally tearing raw, vital energy right out of the atmosphere. The sky above crackled with violent, unnatural crimson lightning as the beasts began to gorge themselves, steadily and loudly, corroding humanity's final, desperate defensive barrier. For the billions of terrified civilians huddled in the smoking ruins of their shattered cities, all remaining hope seemed to evaporate entirely. They looked up from the rubble, and the absolutely impossible happened. The bright, reassuring daytime sky rapidly shifted into a sickly, bruised gray. It was not an approaching storm front. It was the sheer, suffocating mass of the descending Kalan warships. They formed a solid, moving ceiling of alien armor that entirely eclipsed the sun. The entire planet plunged instantly into an artificial, chilling twilight. The ambient temperature dropped severely, and a collective, deafening moan of sheer, unadulterated terror echoed across every single continent. It felt like the physical manifestation of the end of the world, a heavy blanket of doom suffocating the very breath of humanity. In that darkest, most suffocating moment in the history of the human race, when the very last human fighter blinked off the tactical grid and the alien fleet settled confidently directly overhead, Ford Burrell finally moved. His hands danced furiously across the heavy, glowing master console. The enemy had taken the bait. They were locked precisely in the exact coordinate he had mathematically predicted. The jaws of the trap were perfectly set. "Time to wake up the dead," Ford stated, his voice a low, menacing mechanical rasp in the dead silence of the bunker. He smashed his clenched fist down onto the primary execution relay, officially initiating the complex sequence he had kept hidden from the entire world. It was a multi-layered cipher known only as Prometheus. Deep within the boiling core of the Earth, the planet's natural magnetic dynamo was violently and artificially hijacked. The sequence instantly bypassed all standard geological safety limiters, surging an unprecedented, massive wave of geomagnetic force straight upward through the crust. In that exact same fraction of a second, millions of miles of forgotten, useless debris in high orbit answered the call. Tens of thousands of pieces of artificial space junk, dead communication satellites, shattered rocket boosters, and derelict orbital stations that had floated uselessly for decades suddenly flared to brilliant life. Their dormant, rusted cores violently overrode their programming, syncing perfectly and harmoniously with the amplified, roaring magnetic heartbeat of the Earth. The sudden, blinding awakening of the orbital debris was not a desperate, chaotic final act of a dying world. It was the breathtaking culmination of a century of deliberate, agonizing deception. For exactly 100 years, the citizens of Earth had looked up at the stars and wept, believing their united governments were hopelessly corrupt and utterly incompetent. The public had watched in deep despair as the elites seemingly wasted trillions of credits on failed space programs, abandoning manned exploration to instead leave the planet entirely defenseless behind a massive, swirling ring of metallic garbage. The world believed humanity was pathetic and weak, while other unknown civilizations boasted massive, gleaming armadas. The terrifying, brilliant truth was finally laid bare for both the surviving humans and the stunned alien invaders to witness. Humanity had never once intended to build a conventional fleet to fight a traditional interstellar war. The brightest minds of Earth had calculated the brutal mathematics of the cosmos and realized they could never win a sheer numbers game against ancient, spacefaring predators. Instead, operating under the brilliant guise of reckless industrial waste, abandoned orbital platforms, and highly publicized, disastrously failed asteroid mining expeditions, they had spent 10 long decades quietly weaponizing the entire solar system. Those rusty, floating graveyards of space junk circling the Earth were actually highly sophisticated, dormant magnetic relay nodes. Out in the freezing, silent dark between Mars and Jupiter, the vast asteroid belt began to violently shift. Millions of supposedly abandoned, fully automated mining stations drilled deep into the iron-rich celestial rocks suddenly roared to life. Their internal fusion reactors spiked into the red, instantly interlinking with the orbital debris network hovering around Earth. Together, operating in perfect algorithmic harmony, they generated an invisible, incredibly intricate web of pure electromagnetic force. This was not a localized, defensive shield. It was a massive, system-wide snare. It was specifically engineered to catch and severely amplify the furious, charged particle winds constantly bleeding off the violent surface of the Sun. Just as the network fully synchronized, a massive solar flare erupted from the star, and the magnetic grid caught the heavy wave of stellar radiation, spinning it rapidly into a localized, inescapable cage of hard light and extreme spatial gravity. Inside the Kalan fleet, the arrogant, unstoppable advance came to a sudden, violent halt. The advanced, quantum-entangled navigation computers of the alien dreadnoughts shrieked in mechanical agony as their data feeds crashed. Space itself had physically hardened around them. The fragile dimensional fabric they so easily folded and manipulated to travel faster than light was suddenly locked tight, heavily bound by the highly resonant frequencies of the human-made grid. The Kalan warships abruptly lost all ability to initiate hyperspace jumps. They were no longer the undisputed, terrifying masters of the cosmos, free to strike and vanish into the ether. They were deeply, hopelessly trapped inside a sealed, heavily reinforced spatial prison that entirely encompassed the solar system. Deep inside the command bunker, Ford Burrell watched the glowing telemetry data confirm the absolute spatial lock. A cold, feral smile finally touched his lips. He reached forward, his fingers flying across the tactical board. "Let us strip away your armor," Ford commanded the silent, awestruck room. He unleashed a massive, quantum-level electromagnetic pulse shockwave. It detonated, not from the surface of Earth, but perfectly synchronized from the thousands of relay points scattered across the asteroid belt. The pulse was completely invisible to the naked eye, but its devastating effect on the Kalan fleet was immediate. It was mathematically designed to specifically invert the exact quantum frequency of the aliens' supposedly infinite energy shields. The shimmering, impenetrable barriers of light that protected the massive alien armada violently collapsed inward. They short-circuited with a blinding, terrifying flash across the dark sky, leaving the previously invincible mechanical warships exposed as nothing more than naked, highly vulnerable blocks of dark metal floating helplessly in the void. Aboard the colossal flagship, for the absolute first time in their brutal, 10,000-year history of unyielding cosmic conquest. A thoroughly foreign and sickening sensation flooded the synthesized neural pathways of the Supreme Commander. It was pure, unadulterated panic. Red warning runes cascaded like digital blood across every holographic display on the immense bridge. System after system reported catastrophic, irreversible failures. The navigational arrays were dead. The spatial folding engines were permanently fused. The infinite shields were completely burned out. The ancient entity realized with chilling, absolute clarity that they had not cornered a frightened, helpless prey. They had walked blindly, arrogantly, straight into the snapping jaws of a supreme predator. Then, the true apocalyptic scale of Earth's defense finally revealed itself, turning planetary despair into roaring, global astonishment. High above the Earth, the dead, gray surface of the moon began to violently crack. The deep, ancient craters of the lunar surface split open like gigantic hatching eggs. For generations, the moon had been a strictly restricted zone, officially designated by the Earth Council as an unstable, highly dangerous ecological preserve. In reality, the entire celestial body was the largest fixed artillery battery ever constructed in the history of human civilization. Millions of heavy plasma launchers, heavily concealed beneath miles of solid lunar rock and dust, slowly elevated their massive, glowing muzzles from the shadows of the craters. They aggressively drew raw, unlimited power directly from the trapped solar radiation storm, actively pulsing through the magnetic grid. The dark side of the moon suddenly ignited with the blinding, terrifying brilliance of a second sun. Millions of cannons fired in absolute, perfect unison. A solid, roaring wall of superheated, blinding blue plasma tore across the cold vacuum of space at a significant fraction of the speed of light. It slammed directly, unapologetically, into the exposed, completely unshielded vanguard of the Kalan Armada. Without their advanced energy barriers to protect them, the dense alien armor simply melted like wax in a furnace. Thousands of enormous, terrifying dreadnoughts were instantly vaporized, violently reduced to rapidly expanding clouds of superheated atomic gas and scattered ash. The invincible fleet had been physically and psychologically shattered in a single, perfectly orchestrated volley. The alien hunters were bleeding, and the human race had just begun to fight. The Kalan vanguard was utterly decimated, their once immaculate geometric formation of terror reduced to a fractured, violently spinning mess of molten slag and burning debris. The devastating lunar plasma volley had left the surviving alien dreadnoughts completely disoriented, their digital consciousness reeling from the sudden, impossible loss of their invincible shields. In that precise window of profound mechanical confusion, the second phase of Earth's brutal counteroffensive erupted from the darkest corner of the system, deep within the crushing, swirling toxic storms of Jupiter, where the immense atmospheric pressure would instantly flatten conventional metals into thin paper. The dark oceans of liquid metallic hydrogen began to boil. Massive, obsidian-black stealth space submarines, engineered specifically by human hands to endure the gas giant's extreme, localized gravity, silently breached the violent cloud layers. They did not rely on flashy, energy-draining beam weapons that could be easily detected. Instead, they unleashed a staggering, primitive barrage of pure kinetic artillery, thousands of massive, solid tungsten and depleted uranium slugs, accelerated to tremendous velocities via internal magnetic railguns, tore silently across the freezing void. They struck the exposed flanks of the remaining Kalan formation with earth-shattering physical force. Without their quantum barriers to deflect the impacts, the incredibly dense alien armor simply shattered like brittle glass. The heavy kinetic rounds pierced straight through the hearts of the alien vessels, ripping their mechanical vital systems to absolute shreds and leaving thousands of massive ships dead and drifting in the dark. Down in the subterranean command center, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and sweat. But Ford Burrell did not pause to celebrate the tactical victory. His eyes remained locked on the shifting data streams. His face, an impenetrable mask of cold calculation. He knew the ancient predators were only wounded, not dead. His hands moved with terrifying, blinding speed over the master tactical interface, manually accessing a highly classified command hub designated as the Eye of the Storm. This was a localized gravity control station, a supreme marvel of human spatial engineering that allowed him to temporarily and violently manipulate the gravitational pull of specific celestial coordinates. Ford fixed his merciless gaze on the holographic map, highlighting the massive, lumbering Kalan supercarriers that were desperately trying to regroup their shattered defensive lines. With a series of rapid, heavy keystrokes, he aggressively warped the gravitational fields around a dense cluster of rogue asteroids floating precisely along the enemy's escape vector. He did not bother shooting at the alien commanders. He literally threw the environment at them. He weaponized the cosmos itself, essentially turning mountains of solid rock and heavy metals into natural, unstoppable artillery shells. Massive asteroids, some measuring dozens of miles across and weighing billions of tons, were violently ripped from their ancient orbits. They were slingshotted at terrifying, inescapable speeds, directly into the broadsides of the alien supercarriers. The resulting collisions were catastrophic beyond measure. The massive celestial bodies crushed the sleek, obsidian hulls upon impact, violently grinding the highly advanced warships into microscopic dust and creating a horrific, churning meat grinder of raw rock and twisted alien metal in the silent void. A deafening, triumphant roar echoed through the human command bunker as the tactical holograms confirmed the total physical obliteration of the enemy fleet. Generals wept and embraced, believing the nightmare was finally over. But their desperate celebration died violently in their throats as the glowing sensors suddenly spiked with bizarre, terrifying energy readings. The human victory was an illusion. The Kalan race did not perish when their mechanical bodies and mighty ships were pulverized into dust. The biological and metallic components of their physical forms were merely temporary, disposable shells. As their warships disintegrated, millions of blinding, ethereal entities erupted from the floating wreckage. They had forcibly evolved beyond the primitive need for physical matter, escaping into the freezing vacuum of space as beings of pure, highly volatile conscious energy. They were luminous, shifting phantoms of malevolent light, and they immediately began to swarm. Moving at the absolute speed of thought, the energy entities surged aggressively toward the human defensive network. They effortlessly bypassed physical bulkheads, thick kinetic armor, and airtight seals, seamlessly infiltrating humanity's heavily automated weapon systems. They flowed into the firing relays and targeting computers like a virulent digital plague, viciously hijacking the very machinery that had just destroyed their fleet. Absolute, paralyzing panic returned to the human command bunker as the massive, holographic representation of the moon flashed a brilliant, warning red. The majestic, terrifying lunar fortress that had just saved humanity was now fully under the direct control of the enemy. The massive plasma cannons, still glowing white-hot from their previous devastating volley, slowly and agonizingly pivoted on their heavy underground mounts. The targeting lasers, thick as redwood trees, pierced the darkness and painted the continents of Earth in a terrifying grid of impending death. The enemy was rapidly preparing to turn humanity's greatest weapon against its creators, ready to boil the oceans and turn the blue planet into a lifeless, scorched cinder. "They have the targeting locks," a terrified general screamed, grabbing the edge of the console, his face pale with sheer terror. "We have 20 seconds until they fire and wipe us out." Ford Burrell did not flinch. He had mathematically anticipated this exact, desperate evolutionary defense mechanism. He knew the ancient Kaelin would violently shed their physical forms if backed into an inescapable corner. Without a single word of hesitation, Ford slammed his hand onto an isolated, heavily encrypted analog terminal. He instantly and permanently severed every single data link, communication array, and power tether connecting Earth to the Moon. Then, with chilling, absolute resolve, he typed in the master override for the lunar, localized self-destruct sequence. He was sacrificing the entire Moon to win the war. High above the terrified populations of Earth, the lunar surface violently convulsed. Deep beneath the gray dust in the craters, hundreds of highly unstable subterranean fusion reactors were intentionally pushed far past their critical safety limits. The resulting detonation did not just crack the Moon, it completely and utterly shattered it. The explosion was a silent, blooming flower of unimaginable cosmic destruction. Millions of tons of lunar rock were blown outward into space. But more importantly, the sudden, violent collapse of the dense magnetic fields within the artificial core acted as a massive, inescapable energy sinkhole. It instantly sucked in and completely consumed the millions of Kaelin energy entities that had possessed the automated cannons, burying their consciousness forever under billions of tons of radioactive, burning rubble. The night sky of Earth was violently and permanently altered. The familiar, comforting glowing orb instantly replaced by a terrifying, expanding ring of debris and blinding, fiery light. Out in the cold, chaotic remnants of the battlefield, the Supreme Commander of the Kaelin forces realized the absolute, humiliating truth. Their invincible physical fleet was gone. Their brilliant tactical infiltration had been brutally and decisively countered by the sacrifice of a celestial body. They were completely cornered and outmatched by a species they had deemed no better than primitive insects. Driven into a state of sheer, unadulterated madness and desperate, burning fury, the ancient entity transmitted one final, apocalyptic command to the scattered, surviving remnants of its energy forces. They would not surrender, and they would not retreat in shame. The remaining Kaelin entities violently converged, crashing into one another and forcefully merging their ethereal forms. They twisted and coalesced into a single, unfathomably large, pulsating leviathan of pure, starving light. It was a terrifying, formless monster of raw, destructive power that dwarfed the remaining human ships. Abandoning the shattered orbital space around Earth entirely, the massive energy entity whipped its colossal, burning tendrils and launched itself directly toward the center of the solar system. It plunged straight toward the sun. Its horrific intention was mathematically clear to every panicked sensor operator on Earth. The Supreme Commander intended to physically dive into the boiling core of the star and completely drain its infinite energy, aiming to freeze the sun and utterly destroy the entire planetary system in a final, suicidal act of spiteful cosmic vengeance. The apocalyptic leviathan of pure, starving energy tore across the inner system, casting a horrifying, unnatural shadow over the inner planets. Its target was the very beating heart of human existence. If the Supreme Commander successfully merged with the sun and drained its nuclear furnace, there would be no grand final battle. There would be no heroic last stand on the ash-choked plains of Earth. The entire solar system would instantly plunge into an era of eternal darkness and absolute, unyielding ice. Humanity would simply freeze into extinction in the pitch-black void without a single additional shot being fired. A silent and pathetic end to a vibrant species. Inside the suffocating depths of the Nevada bunker, warning sirens shrieked their final, desperate mechanical breaths. Ford Burrell watched the telemetry displays warp and distort. The Prometheus magnetic grid, the glorious trap that had won them the first phase of the war, was violently overloading. The structural integrity of the electromagnetic snare was rapidly collapsing under the sheer, concentrated mass of the unified Kalan entity. It was like trying to hold a raging, tempestuous ocean in a net woven from fragile, decaying thread. Ford knew with cold, agonizing certainty that the grid would completely fail in a matter of mere minutes, unleashing the beast upon the star. Conventional weapons are utterly useless against raw, shifting energy, a commanding officer whispered, his voice trembling heavily with the absolute finality of their impending doom. Ford did not look away from the blinding glare of the tactical monitors. "We do not use conventional weapons," he replied, his voice a hollow, chilling echo in the cavernous room. "We use gravity. We have to detonate an artificial singularity right at the edge of the heliosphere. A localized black hole to swallow it whole before it ever touches the solar core." The command center fell dead silent. The engineering requirements for such a catastrophic event were universally understood by every scientist in the room, and they were a mathematical death sentence. To trigger a localized singularity, a dense, highly unstable core of synthetic dark matter had to be manually delivered and detonated at the exact geographical center of the enemy entity. The delivery vehicle would have to fly straight through the unimaginable, roaring firestorm of the sun's outer corona. It was a guaranteed one-way trip into the deepest, most violent inferno in the known universe. There was absolutely zero possibility of a return trajectory. "I have 10,000 pilots ready to volunteer right now," the Supreme General stated, stepping forward with tears openly welling in his aged, battle-weary eyes. "Give us the dark matter payload. We will get it done." Ford slowly turned away from the console and looked the general directly in the eye. "No," Ford said softly, yet with a terrifying, unmovable authority. "You do not understand the intricate physics of the payload, and a human pilot's reflexes cannot calculate the necessary quantum adjustments in real time within a chaotic solar storm. This is my math. This is my burden. I am taking it." He absolutely refused to hand this horrific death sentence to another human soul. Deep within the highest security vault of the remaining orbital shipyards rested the Icarus. It was the sole existing prototype of a heavily shielded, experimental, stellar diving vessel, specifically designed by Ford years ago to withstand the brutal, melting heat of close solar proximity. It was entirely untested, practically a flying coffin of dense thermal plating and raw, unproven theoretical engineering. Within 1 hour, the launch sequence was forcefully initiated. Across the battered, burning surface of Earth, billions of traumatized survivors stood amidst the smoking rubble of their shattered cities. They stopped fighting the raging fires. They stopped crying over the bodies of the dead. The entire world collectively held its breath, falling into a profound, weeping silence as they watched the live optical feed broadcast from the very edge of the sun. The Icarus looked unimaginably small. It was a minuscule, fragile speck of silver, diving headfirst into an endless, roaring ocean of blinding yellow and angry orange fire. The sheer, epic scale of the cosmos severely dwarfed the tiny vessel, highlighting the desperate, tragic nature of humanity's final gamble. Ford Burrell gripped the heavy steering yokes with white-knuckled intensity as the internal temperature of the cockpit began to rapidly spike. Sweat poured heavily down his face, instantly turning to hissing steam in the superheated cabin air. Outside the heavily tinted, reinforced canopy, colossal solar flares erupted like angry, golden mountains, reaching out into the blackness. He forcefully and violently maneuvered the small ship, weaving desperately between massive, twisting tornadoes of superheated plasma that could vaporize a major metropolitan city in a fraction of a second. The Kalan Leviathan, pulsing with malevolent light, sensed the approaching anomaly. It realized humanity was attempting one final, desperate, defiant strike. The massive energy entity lashed out with chaotic, blinding fury. Gigantic tentacles of crackling, dark purple energy whipped through the raging solar storms, violently hunting the tiny human ship. Ford pushed the experimental engines to their absolute breaking point, barrel rolling the Icarus through narrow, rapidly collapsing tunnels of solar fire to narrowly dodge the lethal, snapping whips of the alien enemy. The metal hull groaned in pure, agonizing metallic torment. Warning lights flooded the cramped cockpit with a blinding crimson glare, screaming digitally that the thermal shields were failing and the dark matter core was dangerously close to premature detonation. Just a little further. Ford gritted his teeth, his vision blurring heavily from the overwhelming, crushing gravitational forces and the excruciating, blinding heat. He was only a few thousand miles away from the dense, pulsating heart of the Kalan entity. The target drop zone was practically within his physical reach. Then, the brutal, unforgiving reality of the cosmos violently intervened. A massive, unexpected surge of solar radiation slammed directly into the rear exhaust ports of the Icarus. The experimental antimatter thrusters screamed, sparked violently, and completely tore themselves apart from the sheer, overwhelming thermal stress. A deafening metallic shriek echoed painfully through the tiny cabin as the primary drive core catastrophically ruptured and vented into the void. The ship violently shuddered, throwing Ford brutally against his heavy safety restraints. The thrusters died. The agonizing, roaring sound of the engines faded into a terrifying, hollow silence, replaced only by the hissing of boiling coolant. The Icarus entirely lost its forward thrust. It was no longer flying. The tiny, crippled vessel was now just helplessly floating, completely dead and adrift in the middle of an infinite, raging sea of stellar fire. Ford stared out the cracked, reinforced glass at the looming, terrifying maw of the energy beast, knowing that his forward momentum was entirely gone. The detonator absolutely required him to reach the exact center, but he was stranded thousands of miles short. Death was no longer a distant, theoretical possibility. It was an absolute, immediate certainty, holding him tightly in its burning, inescapable grasp, drifting in the agonizing silence of the crippled Icarus, surrounded by the roaring inferno of the solar corona. Ford Burrell did not close his eyes to wait for death. Instead, as he watched the colossal Kalan energy leviathan gorge itself on the outer layers of the star, a slow, defiant smile crept across his blistered face. The agonizing heat and the suffocating despair faded into the background as his brilliant mind recognized a fatal, magnificent shift in the local physics. The ancient enemy was absolutely ravenous, drawing in millions of tons of solar plasma every single second. In its blind, arrogant hunger, the entity had generated an immensely powerful, localized gravitational undertow. Ford realized he did not need his shattered engines to reach the target. The Kalan was desperately pulling everything into its heart, and Ford had the ultimate poison pill. With a series of sharp, deliberate commands, Ford manually severed the ship's remaining safety protocols. He entirely deactivated the inertial dampeners, shut down the emergency braking thrusters, and deliberately killed the last flickering remnants of the thermal shields. He surrendered his tiny, fragile vessel completely to the overwhelming gravity of the enemy. Instantly, the dead weight of the Icarus was caught in the terrifying current of the entity's feeding frenzy. The ship accelerated violently, pulled directly into the swirling, blinding epicenter of the Kalan's ethereal form. "Swallow this," Ford whispered, his hand slamming down on the manual detonation override. At the exact geometric center of the alien Leviathan, the synthetic dark matter core activated. The resulting explosion was not a burst of fire, but a profound, terrifying inversion of reality itself. The volatile dark matter reacted catastrophically with the raw, highly concentrated life energy of the Kalan forces. It violently ripped open a localized internal spatial collapse, generating a miniature singularity. The sheer, unfathomable suction of the quantum rift instantly inverted the alien's energy matrix. The monstrous, unified consciousness of the Supreme Commander and the entirety of its remaining armada were violently pulled inside out, screaming in digital agony before being completely and permanently erased into the infinite depths of the quantum void. The implosion was so phenomenally massive that it triggered a cosmic chain reaction. Instead of tearing the sun apart, the collapsing singularity dispersed the purified, residual energy of the Kalan entity outward in a magnificent, blinding shockwave. A radiant, crystalline halo of unprecedented beauty bloomed around the star. The violent cosmic event accidentally, but perfectly assimilated the alien energy into the nuclear furnace of the sun. This permanently upgraded the stellar lifespan by billions of years, providing the ruined Earth with an absolutely boundless, pristine source of exotic radiation to fuel their future. Amidst that apocalyptic release of cosmic forces, the laws of quantum probability miraculously bent. The sheer gravitational torsion of the collapsing rift violently snapped the heavily reinforced cockpit of the Icarus away from the main fuselage. In a 1 in a trillion chance, the small pod was thrown precisely into a narrow, stable, dimensional pocket skating right along the event horizon. Shielded from the incinerating heat and the crushing gravity, the cockpit was violently spat back out into standard space. Several weeks later, a deep space human retrieval team found the battered pod drifting silently in the dark, with Ford Burrell barely alive, but breathing within. From the smoldering ashes of the invasion, Earth stepped boldly into a brand new era. Humanity did not rebuild out of fear. Using the shattered remnants of the Kalan dreadnoughts and the endless energy now radiating from their upgraded star, the first generation of true, human-made interstellar vessels began to take shape in the orbital shipyards. The prey had finally become the apex predator, far away. Across the unimaginable expanse of the cosmos, nestled in a star system millions of light-years distant, a supreme council of multiverse entities gathered in absolute silence. They gazed intently at a massive holographic spectral chart, watching as the insignificant yellow star of Earth suddenly flared with a terrifying, brilliant new frequency. From the deep shadows of the council chamber, an ancient, resonant voice echoed softly. They did not just survive the fire, they have learned how to control the power of the stars. The real game begins now. Thank you so much for listening to today's journey on Z Sci-Fi Stories. We truly appreciate your time and would love to know where you are listening from. So please let us know in the comments. If you found today's story thrilling and want to help us keep bringing these universes to life, please consider supporting our channel with just $1. Your kindness helps us pay our hardworking staff so they can support their families and continue creating better stories for you. You can easily do this by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the donation link provided in the description and pinned comment below. Thank you again, and we will see you in the next adventure.